ahead and start. They're back anyways. Are you saying anything now? I don't know what's going on. Can people hear me? Can hear you clicking on your phone. Your headphones are broken. Okay, I'm sorry. All right, we're gonna go ahead and start. Joe's having technical difficulties. We're gonna go back to the measure further provided as follows. We're talking about the measure. We're gonna get into that right now. Section 2, that the president should proceed at once to condemn the property forfeited under the foresaid act of July 17th, 1862. Section 3, that the commission of appraisers be appointed to appraise said property. Section 4, that the land so seized and condemned should be distributed among the slaves who had been made free by the war and constitutional amendments and who are residing on, hold on a second, said land on the 4th of March, 1861, and sent or since to each head of the family 40 acres, to each adult male, whether head of a family or not, 40 acres, to each widow, head of the family, 40 acres, to be held by them in fee simple, but to be unalienable for 10 years after they should become to seized thereof. Section 5 provided for the raising of the sum of $50 for each homesteader to be used for the erection of a building on his homestead, and that the further sum of $500 million be raised for the purpose of pensioning the veterans of the Union Army. The bill contained several other sections dealing with the subject in connection with the main features as above set forth. Stevens called up this measure for consideration by the House on March 19th, when he made one of his characteristic speeches, brilliant and pungent. Age seems never to have had any effect upon his mental vigor, nor any tendency to modify his sharp invectives. He said, I am about to discuss the question of pain of belligerent traitors. The pain of traitors has been wholly ignored by a treacherous executive and sluggish Congress. I wish to make an issue before the American people and see whether they will sanction the perfect impunity of a murderous belligerent and consent that loyal men of this nation who have been despoiled of their property shall remain without enumeration, either by rebel property or by property of the nation. It is this issue I desire to devote the small remainder of my life. No committee or party is responsible for this bill. Wherever merit it possesses is due to Andrew Johnson and myself. I'm exhausted. I feel better. Oh, you're talking to someone else. My bad. Funny. Andrew Johnson did not falter and began to pin his faith on the fall election of 1876. On September 7th, 1867, Johnson intended full pardon to Confederates. His former proclamation, according to the Tribune, had, quote, left about 100,000 citizens outside the amnesty, but this one leaves out 1,000 or 2,000, end quote. Undoubtedly, at this time, Johnson was being urged towards stronger counter-revolutionary measures. He entertained the idea of ordering the military governor of the 5 southern districts to enroll as voters the former Confederates whom he had included in his last proclamation of amnesty. Clemenceau said that when some of his Southern friends called on him, he admitted, frankly, that only a fear of being disposed prevented him from acting, and he advised them to take the matter into court. To court the South flew. Johnson's provisional governor of Mississippi tried in the name of his state to rejoin the president from executing the Reconstruction laws. The Supreme Court found in April 1867 that its interference, oh, you're back, would be proper. You want to try and talk? Joe, you want to try and talk? Yeah, I can't hear you. I hear you tapping the phone, but I just can't hear your voice. Thereupon, Governor Jackson of Georgia sought to enjoin the Secretary of War. Enjoin the Secretary of War and General of the Army and the District Commander of Georgia. But, I don't know. I'm sorry. Where was I at? Oh yeah, the District Commander of Georgia. But the court decided it had no jurisdictions. A second time, Georgia went to the Supreme Court and failed. Finally, late in 1876, W.H. McCardlin of Mississippi, arrested by military authority under the Reconstruction Act, appealed from the circuit up to the Supreme Court. But Congress, over the president's veto, repealed the status which allowed such an appeal, and by this revolutionary procedure made good its supreme power in Reconstruction over court and president. Radical newspapers published on October a statement that the president had told certain friends in Tennessee that he would resist by force if Congress attempted to impeach him. Johnson denied that he had said anything of the sort, but Republicans made much of the fact that Johnson had ordered cannon furnished to Swan, governor of Maryland, who, like Johnson, had been elected by the Republicans and had gone over to the Democrats. Swan asked the government to furnish him with cannon. Johnson gave Stanton the order to deliver the weapons needed. Stanton flatly refused. When General Grant took his place as Secretary of War, the governor of Maryland renewed his request, which was again granted by Johnson and again refused by Grant. Finally, Swan made up his mind to buy the cannon. Most of the officers serving in Swan's militia were former Confederates. During the fall campaign of 1867, there was fear of panic in the air on account of the vast circulation of greenbacks and banknotes to the extent of $1 billion. With money fluctuating in value, trade became a lottery. Higher protections was put on steel, and woolen goods. But curiously enough, the Democrats in general avoided the tariff issue. They did not follow Johnson's attack on finance because they saw its inconsistency with the reaction of property in the South, leaving the economic argument they embraced with advently race prejudice and concentrated their campaign on this. That person who's, let me try it again, Clemenceau said, the best point of attack for the Democrats is black people. Any Democrat who did not manage to hint in his speech that black people is a degenerate animal, they used would be considered lacking in enthusiasm. The ideal of giving political power to a lot of wild men incapable of civilization, this is the racist words, whose intelligence is no higher than that of an animal. That is the theme of all Democratic speeches. With this, of course, when fetched worship of the Constitution. Johnson looked forward with hope. October election took place in Ohio and Pennsylvania and showed reaction towards the Democrats. In Ohio, R.B. Hayes. Afterward, President ran against Allen G. Thurman. And black suffrage played a large part. Hayes denied the assertion that the government was a white man's government. Quote, "It is not the government of," not the government of any class or sect or nationality or race. It is not the government of the native born or of the foreign born, of the rich man or the poor man, of the white man or the man of color. It is a government of the free men. The monstrous inconsistency and injustice of excluding 1/7 of our population from all participation in the government, founded on the consent of the governed, was held to be impossible. There was no necessary antagonism between the two races which could not be broken down by injustice and equality. Hayes won by less than 3,000 votes, as compared with the Republican majority of 42,000 in 1866. Also, at the same time, the voters rejected the black suffrage amendment by 38,000 votes and elected a Democrat legislator. There were, however, certain other elements. The Republicans had sought to disenfranchise deserters from the army, and Ben Wade had aroused the bitter hostility of Southern elements in Southern Ohio. Ohio expressed itself against the high tariff. Quote, "It filled the pockets of Eastern monopolists," end quote, and in favor of agricultural labor, showing the peculiar contradictions in the minds of the voters. Yeah. Johnson telegraphed Ohio, quote, "Ohio has done its duty and done it in time. God bless Ohio," end quote. Pennsylvania lost nearly the whole of its Republican majority of 30,000. In New York, cannon were kept firing for 2 days. Most of the state elections came in November and showed some reaction towards the Democrats, but not so great as in October. The Republicans won in Massachusetts, Michigan, Wisconsin, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, and Illinois, but were completely defeated in New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. New Jersey refused to strike out the word, quote, "white" from the requirements for suffrage. In New York, the Republicans did not dare to submit to popular votes and proposals to drop the property discrimination against black voters. Maryland adopted a new registry law, which gave the vote to whites only. On the other hand, during 1867, Ohio and Dakota admitted black people to the ballot, and Minnesota in 1868. In this later year, black people were voting in all the New England states except Connecticut. In Iowa, Minnesota, and Dakota, a total of 8 northern states. The South and its friends had a right to charge that the 8 other northern states refused to enfranchise a class to which they were forcing the South to give the vote. In the third annual message of Andrew Johnson's December 3rd, 1867, all masking of the black problem is removed. He is no longer invasive as to the relation of the black worker to the white worker, and his whole economic argument was drowned in race hate. There is no suggestion that black soldiers or black property owners or black people who can read and write should have any political rights. He based his whole argument flatly on the inferiority of the black race. Quote, "It is the glory of white men," end quote, he proclaimed. Oh my goodness. Mallingually. I'm going to look up this word, everybody. Howdy. Hey, nice to see ya. Good to see ya. Come to learn. Come to learn. Learning is great. Learning is amazing. Hold on, cue. There it is. Oh my gosh, I have to turn up the volume.
Magniloquent.
Magniloquently, which is A high-flown, bombastic, and pompous style of speaking or writing, often using fancy, flowery language to sound important, frequently with little substance. And here's the thing. To know what they have had these qualities in sufficient measures to build upon this continent a great political fabric and to preserve its stability for more than 90 years, while in every other part of the world all similar experiments have failed. But if anything can be proved by known facts, if all reasoning upon evidence is not abandoned, it must be acknowledged that in the progress of nations, black people have shown less capacity for government than any other race of people. Bullshit. This guy's a racist. No independent government of any form has ever been successful in their hands. On the contrary, this is so racist, everybody. Wherever they have been left to their own devices, they have shown a consistent tendency to relapse into barbarism. In the southern states, however, Congress has undertaken a coffer upon them the privilege of the ballot. Just released from slavery, it may be doubted. Rather, as a class, they know more than their ancestors how to organize and regulate civil society. Indeed, it is admitted that black people of the South are not only regardless of the South are not only regardless of the rights of property, but so utterly ignorant to public affairs that their voting can consist of nothing more than carrying a ballot to the place where they are directed to deposit it. That's just a racist fucker. Big, huge racist fucker right there, everybody. The great differences between the two races in physical, mental, and moral characteristics will prevent the amalgamation, or fusion of them together in one homogeneous mass. If the inferior obtains the ascendancy over the other, it will govern with reference only to its own interests, for it will recognize no common interests and create such a tyranny that this continent has never yet witnessed. Already, black people are influenced by promises of obfuscation and plundering. They are taught to regard as an enemy every white man who has any respect for the rights of his own race. If this continues, it must become worse and worse until all orders will be subverted, all industry ceased, and the fertile fields of the South grow up into a wilderness. Of all the dangers which our nation has yet encountered, none are equal to those which must result from the success of the effort now making to Africanize the half of our country. It is easy to believe now that the idea that Andrew Johnson and the South planned a coup d'etat was fanciful. The point is that sane and thoughtful men at the time widely believed it. No matter how incredible it may seem to us, we must remember that this was a generation to which it had seemed incredible that the South should succeed. They had seen the incredible happen at fearful cost. It might happen again. The Republicans, therefore, refused to be frightened by the election of 1867. Charles Schultz said that, and here's what he said: "I think that I do not exaggerate that an overwhelming majority of the loyal Union men, North and South, saw in President Johnson a traitor bent upon turning over the national government to the rebels again, and adherently wishing to see him utterly stripped of power, not so much for what he had done, but for what, as they thought, he was capable of doing and likely to do. Impeachment proceedings now hurried forward. They had begun in December 1866, and on February 28, 1867, the Committee on the Judiciary had refused to recommend impeachment of the president, but asked for further investigation. March 2nd, the Reconstruction Act passed. And March 7th, impeachment was moved for the second time in the House. Johnson had notified the Senate of the suspension of Secretary Stanton in December 1867. Early the next year, the Senate refused to concur. Grant gave up the office and Stanton resumed his duties. Stanton was dismissed again in February 1868, and the impeachment of Johnson was determined upon in March. The beginning of the attempt to impeach President Johnson was a memorable scene. Thaddeus Stevens made his speech February 16, 1868. He was hopelessly broken in health, and a hushed, expectant audience listened to every word. He spoke with force and solemnity. Quote, "I doubt," said Charles Sumner, "if words were ever delivered to more effect. He was a dying man, and this was his last word." Who in 1867 represented the considered will be the people of the United States? Certainly not Andrew Johnson, backed by Northern Copperheads and the supporters of a futile attempt at secession. Just as certainly 2/3 of the member of Congress, with the South excluded, as it had been excluded for 6 terrible years, had a clear right to express and repeatedly register popular will. Just checking, making sure. The problem was a difficult one. When can a ruler rule in the United States? The nation, by overwhelming majority, had declared for the Union, for emancipation, to preserve the Union, for no increase in the political power of the white South, and for black suffrage to prevent this increased political power and reward black loyalty. Hold on a second. Got a little dot in my glasses that's bugging me. There we go. This is clear. This clear will of the majority of the people represented in Congress was frustrated by a president who repeatedly refused to obey the planned mandate of the party which elected him. Johnson virtually declared Congress illegal because the South was unrepresented. Congress denied that a criminal could be his own judge. Who could settle this dispute? By the whole theory of the party government. A president must be at least in general accord with his party. His utmost power should not go beyond the suspensory veto, compelling a plebiscite. Yet no president in the history of the United States up to this time had used the veto power like Andrew Johnson to oppose the expressed will of the nation. In 23 cases, he opposed his will to the will of Congress, while Andrew Jackson, his closest competitor, made only 11 vetoes and pocketed vote vetoes. Party responsibility in government was absolutely blocked at the time of crisis. Under any even partial theory of such responsibility, Johnson would have been compelled to resign. But the antiquated constitutional requirement of a system of laws built for another age and for entirely different circumstances were now being applied to the unforeseen conditions. The Constitution made a removal of the president contingent upon his committing, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. Here then came a plain question of definition. Was it a crime in the judgment of the people of the United States in 1867 for a president to block the overwhelming will of the successful majority of voters during a period of nearly 3 years? Stevens and those who followed him said that it was. They did not all pretend that Johnson was personally a criminal with treasonable designs, although some believe even that. On the other hand, it was clear even to many of Johnson's friends that he was, quote, an unfit person to be president of the United States, end quote. They all did this. They all did assert that he had broken the rules by which responsible government could be carried on. The trial started March 30th, 1868, and ended May 6th. Over 2/3 of the members of the United States House of Representatives, 35 out of 54 senators, and a great majority of the voters of the nation outside the former slave states agreed that Johnson should be removed from office. Whether they were right or wrong, the failure legally to convict Johnson has remained to frustrate responsible government of the United States ever since. But no president since Johnson has attempted undefinedly to rule in defiance of Congress. Indefinitely, sorry. The leaders of the abolition democracy still pressed on. Sumner was especially active and destined for several more years of active work. Thaddeus Stevens was near death, but to the very end he fought on. He wished to ask Congress to declare by law that no state had the right to forbid citizens of the United States from taking part of the national election. Thaddeus Stevens died August 11th, 1868, 3 weeks after the ratification of the 14th Amendment was announced, and in his last breath, and even after death, stood true to his principles. Two clergymen of color called and asked leave to see Stevens and pray with him. He ordered them to be admitted, and when they had come to his bedside, he turned and held out his hand to one of them. He sang a hymn and prayed. It was then within 10 minutes of midnight, and the end was to come before the beginning of the new day. He laid motionless for a few minutes, then opened his eyes, took one look, placidly closed them, and without a struggle, a great commoner had ceased to breathe. Thaddeus Stevens was buried in a person of color graveyard. Upon the monument, there is the following inscription prepared by himself. I repose to this quite and scheduled spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited to race by charter rules. I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocate through a long life, the equality of man before his creator. As Charles Sumner said, already he takes his place among illustrious names, which are a common property of mankind. I see him now, as I have so often seen him during life. His venerable form moves slowly and with uncertain steps, but the gathered strength of years in his countenance and the light of victory on his path. Politician, calculator, time served, stand aside, a hero statesman passed to his reward. As a result of the legislation of the 39th and 40th Congress, the United States in 1867 took a portentous, I'm going to look that up, forward steps in democracy. Let me look what that word says. Portentous. I think it's portentous. Sorry, that's weird. Portentous. Yeah, portentous. Okay, all right. For the mass of the nation, it was a step taken under compulsion of fear, without deep forethought, and with a rather dictatic. I'm gonna look up this word too. Didactic, something intended to teach, particularly in the manner that is overly instructive, moralizing, or pedantic. Didactic following out of certain conventional principles, which made universal suffrage seem natural and inevitable. To the South, it was the price of that disaster of slavery and war, which spelled its history from 1830 to 1865, and it was the only price adequate to that fatal mistake. To those men who were guiding American industry towards a new and fateful path, the Southern experiment was simply a political move by which they silenced and held in check the tremendous political power built on slavery, which in many ways and for a generation had threatened the nation and checked its economic development. To a few far-seeing leaders of democracy, this experiment appeared in its truer light. It was a test of the whole theory of American government. It was a dictatorship backed by the military arm of the United States, by which the government of the southern states were to be coerced without accepting a new form of administration, in which the freemen and the poor whites were to hold the overwhelming balance of political power. As soon as political power was successfully delivered into the hands of these elements, the federal government was to withdraw the full democracy and full democracy ensue. The difficulty with this theory was the failure to realize that such dictatorships must last long enough, really, to put the masses of workers in power. That this would be, in fact, a dictatorship of the proletariat, which must endure until the proletariat, or at least a leading united group with clear objects and effects and effective methods, each education and experience had taken firm control of the economic organization of the South. Unfortunately, the power set to begin this dictatorship was the military arm of the government, which more and more was falling into the hands of organized wealth and of wealth organized on the scale never seen before in modern civilization. The new organization of northern wealth was not comparable to the petty bourgeoisie, which seized power after the overthrow of European feudalism. It was a new rule of associated and federated monarchs of industry and finance, wielding a vaster and more dystopic power than European kings and nobles ever held. It was destined to subdue, more simply, Southern agrarianism, but even individual wealth and brains in the North, which were creating a new petty bourgeoisie, a small merchant and skilled artisans. It was inconceivable, therefore, that the masters of the Northern industry, through their growing control of American government, were going to allow the laborers of the South any more real control of wealth and industry than was necessary to curb the political power of the planters and their successors. As soon as the southern landholders and merchants yielded to the northern demand of the plutocracy, at the moment of military dictatorship would be withdrawn and the dictatorship of capital allowed unhampered sway. We see this more clearly today than the nation of 1868 or any of its leaders would possibly envisage it. Even northern industry knew that universal suffrage in the South, in the hands of black people just freed from slavery and of white people just enslaved by poverty, could not stand against organized industry. They promptly calculated that the same method of control, the labor vote, would come in vogue in the South as they were already using in the North, and that the industry which used these methods must in the meantime cooperate with Northern industry. That it could not move the foundation stone upon which Northern industry was consolidating its power. That is, the tariffs, the money system, the debt, and national in place of state control of industry. This would seem to be what the masters of exploitation were counting upon, and it's certainly came true in the bargain of 1876. Thus, by singular coincidence, and for a moment, for the few years of an eternal second in the cycle of 1,000 years, the orbits of two widely and utterly dissimilar economic systems coincided, and the result was a revolution, as a vast and, oh my gosh, portentous. I'm gonna make sure that's portentous. Portentous. Making sure. Probably is. Hey, puppy. Welcome in. Come on, spell it right.
Portentous.
And it's something, usually an omen or a sign that warns of a future typically unpleasant or disastrous events. Portentous, that a few minds were fully conceived it. For the system where these first, that of a democracy which should be universal suffrage, established a dictatorship of the proletariat ending in the industrial democracy, and the other, a system by which a little knot of masterful men would so organize capitalism as to bring under their control the natural resources, wealth, and industry of the vast and rich country, and through that of the world. For a pulse of time, these orbits crossed and coincided, but their central sun were 1,000 light years apart. Even though the blind and ignorant fury of the South and the complacent of the North saw them as one. Reconstruction was an economic revolution on a mighty scale, and with worldwide reverberation. Construction was not simply a fight between white and black race in the South, or between master and ex-slave. It was more and more subtle. It involved more than this. There have been repeated and continued attempts to paint this era as an interlude of petty politics, or nightmare of race hate, instead of viewing it slowly and broadly as a tremendous series of efforts to earn a living in new and untried ways, to achieve economic security, and to restore fatal losses of capital and investment. It was a vast labor movement of ignorant, earnest, and bewildered black men whose faces had been grounded in the mud by their three awful centuries of degradation, and who now staggered forward blindly in blood and tears amid petty divisions, hate and hurt, and surrounded by every disaster, war, and industrial upheaval. Reconstruction was a vast labor movement, and ignorant, muddled, and bewildered white men who had been disinherited of the land and labor, and fought a long battle with sheer subsistence, hanging on the edge of poverty, eating clay and cashing slaves. That's what it says. And now lurching up to manhood. Reconstruction was the turn of white northern migration southward to new and sudden economic opportunities, which followed the disaster and dislocation of war, and an attempt to organize capital and labor on a new pattern and build a new economy. Finally, Reconstruction was a desperate effort of dislodged, maimed, impoverished, and ruined oligarchy and monopoly to restore an anachronism in economic organization by force, fraud, and slander, in defiance of law and order, and in the face of a great labor movement of white and black, and in better strife with a new capitalism and a new political framework. All these contending and antagonistic groups spoke different and unknown tongues. To black men, to black people, free men, as was God. To the poor white, freedom was nothing, he had more than he had use for. To the planter, freedom. For the poor was, they use laziness, that's all I can say. And for the rich, control of power workers. For the northern businessmen, freemen, was opportunity to get rich. Yet, with interpretation agreement was possible here. North and South agreed that laborers must produce profit, and poor white and black people wanted to get the profit arising from the laborers' toil and not to divide it with the employers and landowners. When the northern and the southern employers agreed that profit was most important and the method of getting it second, the path to understanding was clear. When white laborers were convinced that the degradation of black labor was more fundamental than the uplift of white labor, an end was in sight. Not only did all these factors becloud this extraordinary series of movements, so that the truth of the matter in itself was baffling to observers and interpreters, but overall that has spread to this day a cloud of lying and slander, which leaves historians and philosophers aghast, and has resulted in a current theory of interpretation, which pictures all participants as scoundrels, unintelligent, and heroes in combination humanly, improbable, and demonstrable untrue. One cannot study Reconstruction without first frankly facing the fact of universal lying, of deliberate and unbounded attempts to prove a case and win a dispute and preserve economic mastery and political domination by besmirching the character, motives, and common sense of every single person who dared disagree with the dominant philosophy of the white South. The campaign of slander against, quote, I don't know if I can say this, something bad, rose to the climax, which included every northern person who defeated black people and every northern person in the South who was connected with the Army or Freemen's Bureau or with the institutions of learning or who admitted the right of black people to vote or defend him in any way. It was the general, almost universal belief that practically without exception, these people were liars, jailbirds, criminals, and thieves, and the hatred of them rose to a crescendo of curses and filth. Later, this universal attack upon they use carpet something, and that's all I'm going to say, was modified considerably, and it was admitted that there were among them some dissent and high-minded men, although most of them still were regarded as selfish stealers of public funds. On the other hand, so far as black people was concerned, almost no exceptions were admitted. It was easier to traduce him because everyone was ready to believe the worst, and no reply was, for the moment, listened to. There was not a single great black leader of Reconstruction against whom almost unprintable allegations were not repeatedly and definitely made without any attempt to investigate the reliability of sources of information. For the first time in national history, interstate migration became a crime. Hundreds of thousands of Southerners had gone north and west and had been welcomed and integrated into the various states despite their divergent ideas and alien heredity. But when there came a comparatively small number of Northerners into the South, they were reviled unless they conformed absolutely to, in thought and action, with a dead past. The Northern whites were of many classes, former soldiers and officers lingering in the South in connection with the Army or the Freemen's Bureau, or as investigators and farmers. They were reinforced by the army of men who came south with small capital and in many cases succeeded in making their fortune. Most of these had no special love for black people. They had come into a white man's war. And now that black people was free, they were perfectly free to use him and to organize his industrial and political power in their own advantage. Many of these were agents for capital and went down from the north with something of a psychology of modern investment in conquered or colonial territory. That is, they brought the capital, they invested it, they remained in charge of to oversee the profits, and they acquired political power in order to protect these profits. Kind of makes you wonder if like this is kind of like makes me feel like this is the beginning of like what we're seeing, like the United States being bought and paid for by oligarchs and by the ruling class. So on the other hand, there were teachers who came down from the north, army chaplains, social workers, and others who wholeheartedly went into the new democracy to the limit. Extraordinary persons stood forth in this role, like General Fisk in Erstas Carveth of Nashville, Edmund Ware at Atlanta, General Armstrong of Hampton, and a dozen of others. They were crusaders in a great cause of meticulously honest. Naturally, their numbers were comparatively small. They reached primarily students, teachers, and preachers among black people, and only incidentally the class of field hands. It was a battle between oligarchy, whose wealth and power had been based on land and slaves, on the one hand, and on the other hand, oligarchy built on machines and hired labor. The newly organized industry of the North was not only triumphant in the North, but began pressing it in upon the South. Its advance guard was represented by those small Northern capitalists and office holders who sought to make quick money in raising cotton and taking advantage of the low-priced labor and high cotton prices due to the war famine. The labor on the market, instead of being owned like the slaves or excluded from competition, like the poor whites, suddenly found itself bid for and offer not only money wages, but political power and social status. The bidders had no realization at first how high their labor bids were in the Southern custom. They were offering something below the current price of labor in all civilized lands. The northern United States, England, France, most of Germany, and part of Italy were giving labor some voice in governing and in money wage contracts. To the plantation planters, such a wage contract was economic heresy and social revolution. It was blasphemy and eternal damnation to them, and they fought by every conceivable weapon: political power, social influence, murder, assassinations, and systematic lying. The mass of poor whites were in an anomalous position. Those of them who were intelligent or had during slavery accumulated any capital or achieved any position had always attached themselves in sympathy and interest to the planter class. This meant that the mass of arrogant poor white labor had practically no intelligent leadership. Only here and there were their men, like Hampton Helper, who were actually leaders of the poor whites against the planters. The poor whites was in a quandary with regard to emancipation. He had viewed slavery as the cause of his own degradation, but he now viewed free black people as a threat to his very existence. Suppose that freedom for black people meant that black people might raise to be landholders, planters, and employers. The poor whites thus might lose the last shred of respectability. They had been used to seeing certain classes of black slaves above them in economic prosperity and social power. But after all, there were still black people and slaves. Now the freedom had come. Poor whites were faced by a dilemma of recognizing black people as equals or of bending every effort to still keep them beneath the white masses in income and social power. Here and there, certain leaders appeared among the planters, among the more intelligent of the poor whites, and even among the masses, who looked towards political combination and economic alliances with black people. Such persons, the Southerners called, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can use that word. It's a bad word. It's probably something like a race traitor to white people, something like that. But there were, in fact, that part of the white South who saw a vision of democracy across racial lines and who were willing to build up a labor party in opposition to capitalists and landholders. They were, therefore, especially to be feared and were endlessly reviled. They were forced into certain extreme positions as compared with the carpet something and the planters. Men like Honeycutt of Virginia asked not only political rights, but full social equality for black people, and taunted planters and the carpet, not saying the rest, when they did not dare advocate this. When Andrew Johnson said in his veto of the Reconstruction Bill, March 2nd, 1876, quote, "Black people have not asked for the privilege of voting. The vast majority of them have no idea what it means," end quote. He was exaggerating. Black people had certainly voted, not only in the North, but in South Carolina in the 18th century, and in North Carolina, Louisiana, Tennessee in the 19th century. They had asked to vote in the South repeatedly since emancipation. The difference that now came was that an indefinitely larger number of black people than ever before was enfranchised suddenly, and 99% of them belonged to a laboring class. Whereas by law, black people who voted in early history of the country were for the most part property holders and perspective, if not actually constitute of a petty bourgeoisie. When freedom came, this mass of black labor had not without intelligent leadership, and a leadership which, because of former race prejudice and the presence of color line, could not be divorced from the laboring masses, as had been the case with poor whites. The group of intelligent free black people of Washington, Richmond, Charleston, and especially New Orleans had accumulated some wealth and some knowledge of group cooperations and initiatives. Almost without exception, they accepted the new responsibility of leading the emancipating slaves. Unselfishly and effectively, free black people from the North, most of whom had been born in the South, and new conditions came back in considerable numbers during Reconstruction and took their place as leaders. The result was that black people were not, as they are sometimes painted, simply a mass of densely arrogant toilers. The rank and file of black labor had a notable leadership of intelligence during Reconstruction times. I'm glad he's touching on this, because we've been nothing but listening to what these white fuckers are doing. So I'm glad he's touching on like black people had all these things. So this is a good shift. It's a good shift for me. It was, however, a leadership which was not at all clear in its economic thought. On the whole, it believed in accumulation of wealth and the exploitation of labor as a normal method of economic development. But it also believed in the right to vote as the basis of defense of economic life, and gradually but surely it was forced by the demand of the mass of black laborers to face the problem of land. Thus, black leaders gradually but certainly turned towards emphasis of economic emancipation. They wanted black people to have the right to work at a decent rate of wages, and they expected that the right to vote would come when they had sufficient education and perhaps a certain minimum of property to deserve it. It was this, among other things, that was the cause of a tremendous push towards education, which black people exhibited. What is this saying? Okay. On the other hand, their desires for economic enfranchisement, for real abolish of slavery, had been affronted by the black codes. They were scared and hampered in the very beginning of their freedom by these enactments, and by the way in which these and other laws were executed. The government replied before the death of Abraham Lincoln with government guardianship in the shape of a Freedmen's Bureau. This bureau never had a real chance to organize a function properly. It was hastily organized. It had to use the persons at hand and on the ground largely for its personnel. It had at first no government appropriations, and in the end only limited appropriations, and it was always faced by the probability of quick dissolution. It was surrounded from the beginning by the spirit which enact the black codes. Southerners were desperately opposed to it because it stood between them and the exploitation of labor towards which they were impelled by their losses and high price of cotton. If they had been allowed to exploit and drive black labor after the war, many Southerners, despite their losses, could have partially recouped their fortunes. But there came an organization which demanded money, wages, for employers who had no money, and demanded the modern treatment of labor from former slave drivers. Besides the Freedmen's Bureau, and before it, there was the chance of black people to seek the advice of their former masters, and in many cases this was willingly and wisely given, particularly in the case of masters ready to assist a new economic regime. But it was hindered by several considerations. First, any new union between former masters and black people was rekindling an old enmity and jealousy of the poor whites against any combination of the white employer and black laborer, which would again exclude the poor white. Planters, therefore, had to be careful of any open sympathy and or cooperations with the black laborer. Already his ranks had been disseminated by war and his social status threatened by poverty. Then, too, insofar as black laborers was guided by the Freedmen's Bureau, by Northern philanthropy, and by Northern capital, he brought upon himself the bitter enmity of the former master, so that on the whole, while there was considerable advice and help from the former master, in the long run, it did not and could not amount to much. Doing pretty good. All right. Then, too, we must remember that these former slaveholders did not believe that black people could advance in freedom. They knew, of course, that some could, but even if these could, how could white men and masters cooperate with them? And the whole trend of teaching had been at this was utterly impossible. If black people succeeded insofar as they did, it would lead straight to social equality and amalgamation. And if they did not succeed, it would lead to the deterioration in culture and civilization. The real economic battle then lay finally in a series of attempts comprised between planters and can't say that, and I can't say that one, but poor white laborers and black people. First, the planters moved towards the political control of black people to fix their economic control. The poor whites had, of course, feared, and their fears were voiced repeatedly by Andrew Johnson. Many people in the North looked upon this as a possible and threatening answer to the enfranchisement of black people. The combination was frustrated because the carpet, not saying that, offered black people better terms, offered them the right to vote and to hold office and some economic freedom. When this economic freedom looked towards landholding and higher wages, it could be accomplished only at the expense of the employing class. And so far as black labor accepted, as it had to accept the offer of the carpet, not saying it, and scallywags, I think is it alienated the planters. And not only that, but it frightened the poor whites. Here again, in the case of slavery, there was a combination in which the poor whites seemed excluded unless they made common causes with black people. This union of black and white labor never got a real start. First, because black leadership still tended towards the ideals of a petty bourgeoisie, and the white leadership tended distinctly towards strengthening capitalism. The final move, which arranged all these combination and led to the catastrophe of 1876, was the combination of planters and poor whites in defiance of their economic interests, and with the use of lawless murder and open intimidation. It was a combination that could only have been stopped by government force, and the army, which was the agent of the federal government, was sustained in the South by an organized capital of the North. All that was necessary was to satisfy Northern industry. That the new combination of the South was essentially a combination which aimed at capitalistic exploitation on conventional terms. The result was the withdrawal of military support and the revolutionary suppression, not only of black suffrage, but the economic development of black and white labor. It was not only after the period which this book treats that white labor in the South began to realize that they had lost a great opportunity, that when they united to disenfranchise and the black laborer, they had cut the voting power of the laboring classes into white labor. So again, white people going against their own fucking interests. White labor in the populist movement of the 1880s tried to realign the economic warfare in the South and bring workers of all colors into united opposition to the employers. But they found that the power which they had put in the hands of the employers in 1876 so dominated political life that free and honest expression of public will at the ballot box was impossible in the South, even for white men. They realized that it was not simply black people who had been disenfranchised in 1876, it was white laborers as well. The South had since become one of the greatest centers of exploitation of labor in the world, and labor suffered not only in the South, but throughout the country and worldwide and world over. Curious the contradiction. What has been the criticism and comment accompanying this great controversy and revolution in 1866 to 1876? Floods of tears and sentiment have been expanded on the suffering and disillusionment of the slave baron, while the equally great losses of Northern and Southern labor had been forgotten. And above all, the plight of the most helpless victims of the situation of black freemen had been treated with callous and hardening judgments, cemented in hate. The Northerner businessman has justly been accused of being motivated during this period chiefly by greed and profit. But the profit and greed of the slaveholders, which caused the whole catastrophe, and of the planters who forced an unjust and still dangerous solution, has been sickled or with sentiment. In all this, one sees the old snobbery of class judgment in new form, tears and sentiments, from Maria Antoinette on the scaffold, but no sign of grief for the gutters of Paris and the field of France, where the victims of exploitation and ignorance lay rotten in piles. The South, after the war, presented the greatest opportunity for a real national labor movement, which the nation never ever saw or is likely to see for many decades. Yet the labor movement with but few exceptions, never realized the situation. It never had the intelligence or knowledge as a whole to see in black slavery and Reconstruction the kernel of meaning of labor movement in the United States. After Lincoln's assassination, the General Council of the International Workmen's Association under Karl Marx sent the address to Andrew Johnson. After a gigantic civil war, which, if we consider its colossal extension and its vast scenes of action, seems in comparison with the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War and the 33 Years' War, the War of the Old World, scarcely to have lasted 90 days. And the task, sir, devolves upon you to uproot by law that the sword has failed, and to preside over the more difficult work of political reconstruction and social regeneration. The profound consciousness of your great mission will preserve you from all weaknesses in the execution of your stern duties. You will never forget that the American people, at the inauguration of a new era of emancipation of labor, placed the burden of leadership on the shoulders of two men of labor, Abraham Lincoln, the one, and the other, Andrew Johnson. In 1865, September, another address over the signature of Marx declared boldly, "Justice against a fraction of your people having been followed by such dire consequences, put an end to it. Declare your fellow citizens from this day forth free and equal, without any reserve. If you refuse them citizens' rights, while you exact from them citizen duties, you will sooner or later face a new struggle which will once more drenched your country in blood." The National Labor Union of the Workers was organized at Baltimore, Maryland, August 20th, 1866. There were 60 delegates, and on their banner was inscribed, quote, "Welcome to the son of toil from the north, east, south, and west," end quote. The address was issued on cooperation, trade unions, apprenticeship strikes, labor of women, public land, and political action. As to black people, the union admitted that it was unable to express an opinion which would satisfy all, but the question must not be allowed to pass unnoticed. A black worker had been neglected. Cooperation of the African race in systematic organizations must be secure. Otherwise, black people must act as scabs, as in the case of Culker's color. What are those? We're going to look this up. I don't know what this word is. Again, white people, come on now. Come on now. Oh, wait, no. A skilled tradesperson who seals joint seams and cracks in structures. Okay. Imported from Virginia to Boston during the strike on an 8-hour question. There should be no distinction of race or nationality, but only separation into two great classes: laborers and those who live by other labor. Black people were soon to be admitted to citizenship and the ballot. Their ballot strength would be of great value to union labor. If labor did not accept them, capital would use black people to split white and black labor, just as in Austria, government had used race dissension. Such a lamentable situation should not be allowed to develop in America. Trade unions, 8-hour leagues, and other groups should be organized among black people. Here was the first halting note. Black people were welcome to the labor movement, not because they were laborers, but because they might be competitors in the market. And the logic conclusion was either to organize them or guard against their actual competition by other methods. It was to this later alternative that white American labor must unanimously turn. This was manifest at the second annual meeting in Chicago in 1867, where the black problem was debated from more frankly and less successfully. The president called attention to black people whose emancipation had given them a new position in the labor world. They would now come in competition with white labor. He suggests that the best way to meet this situation was to form trade unions among black people. a committee of three on black labor was selected. The Committee of Black Labor reported that having had the subject under consideration and after having heard the suggestions and opinions of several members of this convention, pro and con, they had arrived at the following conclusion. Hold on a second, I got something in my glasses again. Here they go. That while we feel the importance of the subject and realize the danger in the future of competition in mechanical black labor, yet we find the subject involved in so much mystery, and upon its so wide diversity of opinion amongst our members, we believe that it is expedient to take action on the subject of this National Labor Congress, revolved at the subject of black labor, be laid over till the next session of the National Labor Congress. The report of this committee brought a whirlwind of discussions, which lasted throughout the whole day. Black people will bear to be taught his duty, and this is what they're saying. The black people will bear to be taught his duty and has already stood his ground nobly when the member of a trade unions did not like to confess to the world that there was a subject with which they were afraid to cope. This very question was at the root of the rebellion, which was the war of the poor white men of the South, who were forced by the slaveholders into the war. In New Haven, there was a number of respectable mechanic people of color, but they had not been able to induce the trade unions to admit them. Was there any union in the states which would admit men of color? The men of color was industrious and susceptible to improvement and advancement. There was no need to entering of any discussion of the matter. There was no necessity for the foisting of the subject of black labor, or the appointment of a committee to report thereon. Black people would combine together of themselves and by themselves without the assistance of whites. God speed them, but let not the whites try to carry them on their shoulders. Time enough to talk about admitting men of color to trades, unions, and to the Congress when they applied for admission. White strikings against black people and creating an antagonism which will kill off the trade unions unless the two be consolidated. There is no concealing the fact that the time will come when black people, quote, will take possession of the shops if we have not yet have taken possessions of black people. If the working men of the white race do not conciliate with black people, the black vote will be cast against them. The capitalists of New England now employ foreign boys and girls in their mills to the almost entire exclusion of the native-born population. They would seek to supplant these by people of color workers. Little danger of black men wanting to enter trade unions any more than Germans would try to join the English societies in America. The whole question was finally dodged by taking refuge in the fact that the Constitution invited all labor. Sylvius, president of the International Labor Movement, spoke out in 1868 on slavery. Here's what he said. Whatever your opinion may be as to immediate causes of the war, we can all agree that human slavery, property of men, was the first great cause. And from the day that the first gun was fired, it was in my earnest hope the war might end until slavery ended. No man in America rejoiced more than I at the downfall of black slavery. But when the shackles fell from the limbs of those 4 million black people, it did not make them free men. It simply transferred them from one condition of slavery to another. It placed them upon the platform of the white working men and made all slaves together. I do not mean that freeing black people enslaved the white. I mean that we were slaves before, always have been, and that the abolishing of the right of property in men added 4 million of black slaves to the white slaves of the country. We are now all one family of slaves together, and the labor reform movement is the second Emancipation Proclamation. In the meeting of the National Labor Union in New York in 1868, there was no mention of black people. But in 1869 in Philadelphia, among 142 representatives, there appeared 9 black representing various separate black unions and organizations. This pointed a way out, which labor eagerly seized. Contrary to all labor philosophy, it would divide labor by racial and social lines, and yet continue to talk of one labor movement. That's a contradiction. Through this separate union, black labor would be restrained from competition and yet kept out of the white race unions where power and discussions lay. The resolution was adopted, saying that the National Labor Union would recognize neither color nor race in the question of the rise of all labor, and people of color laborers were urged to form their own organization and send delegates to the next conference. Black people responded and declared that all black people wanted was a fair chance, and no one would be the worse off for giving it. Isaac Myers, their leader, said, "The white laboring man of the country have nothing to fear from people of color laboring men. We desire to see labor elevated and made respectable. We desire to have the highest rate of wages that our labor is worth. We desire to have the hour of labor regulated, as well to the interest of the laborer as to the capitalist. Mr. President, American citizenship for the black man is a complete failure if he is proscribed from the workshop of the country." End quote. In 1869, the General Council of the National Working Men's Association sent the letter signed by Karl Marx to the President of the National Labor Union. The immediate tangible result of the Civil War was of course, a deterioration of the condition of American working men, both in the United States and in Europe. The colossal burden of a public debt was shifted from hand to hand in order to settle it upon the shoulders of the working class. The prices of necessaries, remark one of our statesmen, have risen 78% since 1860, while the wages of simple manual labor have risen 50%, and those of skilled labor 60%. Pauperism, quote unquote, he complains, quote, is increasing in America more rapidly than population. Moreover, the suffering of the working class are a glaring contrast to the new fangled luxury of financial aristocracy, shoddy aristocracy, and other vermin bred by the war. Still, the Civil War offers a compensation in the liberation of slaves and the impulse which is thereby given our own class movement. Another war, not sanctified by a sublime aim or a social necessity, but like the war of the old world, would forge chains for the free workmen instead of sundering those of the slaves. Salvias, president of the International Labor Movement, acknowledged this letter, but said nothing about slavery, confining himself to attacking the moneyed aristocracy. Real quick, we're on page 404. I'm going to send a bookmark. 404. I'm going to look ahead. All right, 404. Let's find out. Probably not. Probably have to find a different stopping point. Yeah, I don't see anything time soon. Because I'm already on 4:14. All right, I'm going to have to find a stopping point here soon. Okay. Thus, American labor leaders tried to emphasize the fact that there was a new element, new not in the sense that it had not been there. It had been there all the time, but new in the sense that black workers must now be taken account of, both in his own interest and particularly in their interest. He was a competitor and a prospective underbidder. Then difficulties appeared. The white worker did not want black people in his unions, did not believe in him as a man, dodged a question, and when he appeared at conventions, asked him to organize separately. That is outside the real labor movement, in spite of the fact that this was a contradiction of all sound of labor policies. As black laborers organized separately, there came slowly to realization that the fact that here was not only separate organizations, but a separation of leading ideas. Because among black people, particularly in the South, where there was being put into force one of the most extraordinary experiments of Marxism that the world before the Russian Revolution had seen. That is backed by the military power of the United States. A dictatorship of labor was to be attempted, and those who were leading the black race in this vast experiment were emphasizing the necessity of the political power of organization backed by protective military power. On the other hand, the trade union movement of white laborers in the North was moving away from the ideal of moving away from politics. They seemed to see a more purely economic solution in their demand for higher wages and shorter hours. Era Stewart spoke for quote, men who labor excessively, robbed of all ambition to ask for anything more than will satisfy their bodily necessities, while those who labor moderately have time to cultivate tastes and create wants and additions to mere physical comfort. But Stewart was thinking of black people and only once barely mentioned them. We rejoice that the rebel aristocracy of the South had been crushed. We rejoice that beneath the glorious shadow of our victorious flagmen of every claim, lineage, and color are recognized as free. But while we will bear with patience and endurance the burden of the public debt, we yet want it to be known that the workmen of America will in future claim a more equal share of the wealth their industry creates, in peace and in more equal participation on the privileges and blessings of those free institutions defended by their manhood and many a bloody field of battle. Not a word was said about black suffrage and the need for labor vote. Black and white, if the demands of labor were to be realized, indeed at the very time that the Southern labor had to be enfranchised, Northern labor realized that the right to vote meant little under the growing dictatorship of wealth and corporate control. It made a little difference that what laws were made, as long as their interpretations by the courts and administrations were dictated by capital. Some proposed thereof to fight their battle out directly with the employers on the one battleground of economic bargaining, with strikes, violence, and secret organizations as methods. Let's see here. I think I'll stop there. So, good job, white laborers. Fuck you. This is like This is like, this should tell us why we're at where we're at today and where this all comes from. Feel like he's laying it out for me. You know what I mean? On this. You can't say anything. 405.
You can't hear me?
Now I can.
Okay. I took my headphones off so I could talk at least at the end.
Go ahead and go.
Okay, so carpetbaggers are white people from the north who came to the south willing to work with black people and help them. But they still wanted capitalism and their money in their pocket. But they paid more than Southerners, and they offered more than Southerners. Southerners hate them. When it's taught to us in school, we say some bad things about the Northerners that came down here and thought they would run the South. But that's all carpetbaggers are. Scallywag is a worse term, but it's a white on white crime. So
what? Go. Did I lose you? I lost you. You're so low.
you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, so scallywag was a white on white crime. It was white people that weren't very good, and other white people that weren't very good called them that. So, like, it's up to you if you want to use that word, because it's a white on white crime. But carpetbagger is actually should be considered a term of almost endearment.
Labor. Yeah. Anything else? I can't hear you. There you are.
Okay, it just depends. It's like TikTok's really messing up. I don't know if it's your live or TikTok or what. Anyways, I really enjoyed the reading. I kind of knew this stuff because I read another book on Reconstruction. But white people just failed. White people failed in every which way. White people failed in the end of the Civil War. I know capitalism sucks and still sucks, and we would have to take it down eventually anyways, but it would have been so much better for everybody if we hadn't have been such asshats.
I agree. Does anybody else want to come up and say anything? Anybody else any questions? Most likely not. All right. I don't think anybody else wants to come up. No, it's just us three anyways. All right then. Well, I will go ahead and close this